What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Muscle Memoirs Podcast. I am very happy to be joined once again by Abel Csabai and Dave Maconi. Our conversation on nutrition went so well, I had to have the guys back on to talk about some training. Fellas, how we doing today?
Feeling good, man. Feeling refed and a little more alive.
Yeah, I'm just feeling well fed. So all good.
Always a good feeling. So our topic of discussion today is training. Abel recently released an awesome video kind of providing some points to consider when it comes to this idea of increasing sets from week to week, even some differing opinions about this Renaissance periodization style of training that has become popularized. And for the first half of our discussion today, I basically want to highlight the primary points from this video, or I guess like little solo podcast that Abel made on it. And I think for this conversation, I'll start by highlighting the primary point. I'll pass it on to Dave to get his thoughts on it. And then Abel, basically add on anything you think we missed, or if any new thoughts come to mind on these ideas that we're mentioning, feel free to add those in. Sound good?
Yep.
So I think the first thing, or the primary important concept to kind of get across and to gain a better understanding of, is this very basic idea of progressive overload. And what is it? And this seems to be the fundamental thing in resistance exercise. We all know that training has to get harder over time. There needs to be some sort of progressive overload within the training system. But I think when it comes to determining whether or not increasing sets from week to week is a good idea in general, comes to how you perceive the concept of progressive overload. So I think if we perceive progressive overload as this need to intentionally change training to make it harder from week to week, then this would be a good idea. We need to increase sets. We need to increase our level of effort each week in order to induce progressive overload, in order to continue driving some sort of adaptation. But on the other hand, and this seems more closely aligned with what Eric Helms was getting across, or what Brian Miner has talked about on this podcast, is that progressive overload is more so a consequence of sufficient training or an adaptation. So basically, the training from the week prior, if we look at this on a micro scale, was sufficient. That fatigue has cleared, or an adaptation has resulted, which allows you to increase the number of reps or the amount of load you're able to use in the following session. So with that being said, Dave, when it comes to this idea of progressive overload, what are your thoughts? Is it something that we need to intentionally chase or manipulate from week to week, or is it basically an adaptation of having a solid training program in place?
Yeah, I think it's an important distinction. I think we're going to talk about DC training in a little bit, and we talk about Dante. This is something I tried to have a conversation with him about, but it's kind of hard to do it through text and like online. Sometimes these points don't get across very well, but he will talk about how, like, what's the best way to get big? Look at these guys, like they get super strong. And I don't disagree with that. I'd say, if you get somebody from a 135 for 10 bench to a 225 for 10 bench, they're going to have much bigger shoulders, triceps, and chest. But as you pointed out, is that a consequence of the training, or is doing that what actually led to the changes? And those are different things. Somebody else had recently, I think it might have even been a conversation, I forget if it was you and me, Abel, or somebody else, but we were basically saying how, volume is this driver, and it's very easy to say, oh, but look, like you could have somebody doing, go from 2 sets a week to 20 sets a week. It doesn't mean that they're bigger, whereas, if they made all these strength gains, they will be. And that's true, but it's like, what led to those strength gains? So I just want to point out that is an important distinction. I think it's probably, I think it's a combination of the two. But I think it is the case that you have to have the stimulus, and then that is leading to the ability to progress. So it is possible that you just add volume and then that inherently makes you stronger the next week. You can't just say, well, just add 100 pounds to your lift. Okay, that's great, but how do I do that? You're right that if I do that, that consequence will mean that I have gained muscle, but that doesn't mean that just sticking with, like, let's say one set and just trying to add all this weight is the best way to do it. So I would tend to lean towards, you need to have a sufficient workout and a sufficient stimulus, and that will then lead to the ability to progress in the next workout. And then how you do that, how you get that stimulus, is obviously, up for debate and a lot of what we're going to talk about.
Abel?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have that much to add. Basically, Dave summed it up really well. And I almost feel like if this understanding is correct, that your ability to push more load or do more reps or just improve your performance is not the stimulus, but it is just a consequence of training, then I think the word overload or progressive overload is almost a bit of a misnomer. It should be called something like adaptive overload or something like that, because this is what creates this confusion in people's heads when we discuss these different approaches, like increasing sets week to week or pushing the load more, because then you can get into these arguments of, well, what's going to create the bigger stimulus, doing more sets or pushing more load? But it's that's not really the right question, because that's not the stimulus in and of itself. But if you're thinking of overload as in you're making your training harder and harder, then it could make sense, for example, to do more and more sets, because that's definitely going to escalate your training from easier to harder. But you're not necessarily making your training harder in the sense that it is more challenging at week 5 than it was at week 1. It might be just equally challenging, but the absolute load is still going up because your ability to handle loads is going up. So, I gave the analogy earlier on as in, for example, a calorie deficit and weight loss. And one could think of, okay, the calorie deficit is the stimulus for weight loss. But then you observe that, okay, over time, as you're losing more and more weight, you have to decrease your calories, right? Dave went from 2,700 calories down over to 1,000. So one could think, okay, you drop your calories a bit lower week to week, but that's not the stimulus for weight loss. That's more of a consequence of successful weight loss. And you just have to decrease your calories over the weeks to make sure that you're still in that same deficit. So that's pretty much how I'm thinking of it as well.
I really like you coining that new term here, because these are pretty different concepts. So this idea of adaptive overload or progressive overload, and how you perceive these concepts and which one you might align with more is definitely going to affect how you structure your training. Abel, you kind of touched on, making your training harder, and basically in reference to this concept of progressive overload, I want to mention a very specific example that you made in your video on this topic, and it was this comparison of two individuals. And we have one guy who is squatting 550 for 3 sets of 8, and we have another guy who is squatting 510 for 5 sets of 8. And in this theoretical example, it's who is bigger. And you kind of gave your position on this. I think you made it a bit nuanced, and you didn't push too hard in one direction or the either. I kind of want to take a hard step in one direction with this, and I think, all things considered, if we control for confounding variables here, the guy who is squatting 550 for 3 sets of 8 is going to be bigger than the guy squatting 510 for 5 sets of 8. And basically, we know that there's a very strong correlation between muscle size and strength. And in the context of progressive overload and making training harder, I think it's important to consider that this guy squatting 550 for 3 sets of 8, he can always just spend another half hour in the gym and do 2 more sets. And he could also, reduce the load on those 2 sets down to 510, and it would make it even easier to get those sets done. Similarly, we can always modulate our effort within a training session. Sure, I could start out week 1 and train to an RPE 7, and then the next week I could change my training and train and complete sets to an RPE 8, but am I really making training harder? Am I actually getting better? That's kind of the concept we're primarily concerned with. Are changing these variables actually making us better, or are we just kind of moving stuff around for the sake of it? So with that being said, Dave, in this specific example I gave, who do you think would be bigger? And then in relation to that, is increasing sets or increasing your effort from week to week really needed to get better, or a sign that you are better if you're able to do these things? Or are we just kind of moving stuff around and potentially creating excess noise without much benefit from it?
Yeah. So for one, I'm glad the distinction was made there about like making the workouts harder. I think for some reason that's talked about like, oh, your workouts have to get harder and harder over time. I guess it depends on how you define harder. But if you're defining harder as like a session RPE, like, okay, 1 to 10, how difficult was that? I don't think there's really that much evidence that your workouts need to get, quote, harder. I mean, that would be like saying after 20 years, if that's now a 10 out of 10, then what were you doing 5 years in? Was that a 3 out of 10? Like, you're pushing yourself very hard pretty much from day one. I mean, I guess you could say the first year you could make good progress without actually trying that hard. But I mean, I was destroying myself in the gym at 15, probably harder than I am now, but I'm obviously a lot bigger now. So I don't think if we're talking about harder, just like how difficult was it, that there's any logic behind saying these workouts need to get harder. Obviously, you do need to be pushing more weight and load and volume over time. But to the specific example, I actually don't think there would be much of a difference between the two. Like, assuming these are like twins, you're controlling for everything else. If both of these twins started at like, 135 for 5, and they both, they got up to either whatever it was, 510 for more sets or 550 for fewer sets, I think they're both going to be massively bigger than they used to be. I think at that point, you're probably not going to see, I mean, what's the difference in measurement? Maybe like a quarter of an inch on the quads, like on the thigh measurements. I think if you were to give a more extreme example, 500 for a lot of sets or 650 for like one set, then like maybe, more of a distinguishing factor there. But I think they're so close, it's not really going to matter that much. Like, I understand the principle that you're trying to make there. I just think in both cases, they're going to be massively bigger than they used to be. I don't know if you'd really see much of a difference.
Is it my turn?
Yes, Abel.
Was waiting for the sign. Yeah, so actually there's a lot to this actually, and this is I wish I was more of an external processor, because then I could give a much more compelling answer. But in my video I touched on this, and I played in a little clip that Mike from some other podcast, and he gave this example or a similar example. And like I mentioned in the video, so it depends on how we define things. So if we say, okay, you do 3 sets, I do 6 sets. First of all, are we talking about set rest periods, and we are both repeating the same number of reps? Just you do it for 3 sets, I do it for 6 sets. That obviously matters, because then if you can do something for 6 sets for the same reps, set rest periods, that means that the first set was actually very easy. So I think if this number that you gave just now, the 510 for 6 versus 550 for 3, if that's the same that you emailed over to me, then I actually did the math, and I calculated that basically the estimated 1RM would almost be the same in these two cases. So maybe that was not the best example. So if you can do something for 6 sets, that means that the first set was probably 5 reps in reserve or something like that. So you probably could have done it for 15 reps or 14 reps or something like that. So in that case, that means that you're strong as hell. You just left a lot of reps in the tank. If you can do something for 3 sets, then maybe with a 1 rep in reserve on the first set, you could have done it for 12 reps or something. So you can actually calculate this. The reason why I didn't take a very hard stance in the video, as in, no, the person who is stronger is definitely going to be bigger, is because There is some hard science on it from a mechanistic standpoint, that a bigger muscle with a bigger cross-sectional area can produce more force, so it will be stronger. So there is that, but it's not like there is no contention on this topic that if you're stronger, you're also going to be bigger, or if you're bigger, you're going to be stronger. Like if you listen to someone like Jeremy Lenicky, he would contest that idea to some extent. Even though I don't agree with him, I think he has some compelling arguments. So, and hypertrophy also has an endurance component to it. So basically, your hypertrophy gains will be a combination of your strength gains and your work capacity related adaptations. I'm looking for a better word, but just cannot recall it right now. So you could say that if you take your performance from a place where you could lift very impressive weights, but your performance was dropping off super fast, and you get it to a place where it stays more constant, that you have improved. But that's also tricky because anecdotally, there is just a really large inter-individual variability between people. So there are just people with really poor work capacity. Their performance just drops up really fast. And that's what, if you ask the Mike Israetel, he would probably tell you that those tend to be like very fast twitch dominant people. I don't know if that's the mechanism there, but you do see these people. They're strong as hell and often also very, very muscular, but they don't handle volume very well. And their reps tend to go something like, 12, 6, 3, whereas some people are just like 10, 10, 10. So that's a very variable thing, and I don't know how much that correlates with better gains in the actual outcome. So it's tricky, but yeah. So that's my very vague answer there.
Cool, got it. When we consider this need to make training harder over time, based on your own personal experiences, and I'll kind of touch on mine, because I have used a style of training that increases sets from week to week in a pretty large range from something like 10 to 20, and I've also kept my sets stagnant from week to week. Based on this premise that we need to make training harder over time, it would kind of seem to me that if you weren't increasing sets from week to week or incrementally increasing the RPE, that would kind of suggest that if you don't do these things, that you would just be able to run like these very long and super productive training blocks because you're not generating sufficient fatigue throughout. I know that's not the experience for me. Basically, I can, run a progressive block for like 6 weeks, and it doesn't really matter whether I keep sets stagnant or if I, manipulate the aforementioned variables. But what have you guys found? As far as this need to make training harder, have you found that if you don't consciously manipulate these things to make training harder, that you're not generating sufficient fatigue, and this affects your deload time and you can run longer or shorter blocks? Dave, what are your experiences?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to see this kind of like storm of Renaissance periodization principles, because it's very much just in this niche that it's talked about. I mean, very few people follow these principles. I mean, I don't know almost anybody outside of this now like niche within the niche of evidence-based fitness that do this. People have mesocycles and microcycles and all of that, but and again, I hate to just look at anecdote and say, well, what do these big guys do? But truly, how many people do you know who have gotten really big, who spend all this time adding sets and then resetting and then adding sets? It's just not something that you typically see. I think is it necessary? Obviously, absolutely not. I guess the question is it optimal? Does it help speed things up a little bit more? I understand the argument for it. I just don't think, basically when you actually look at like the principles, you're assuming that there's this resensitization that happens. And even Mike will say that when you're at an advanced level, the difference between MEV and MRV is very small. So it's kind of like, I don't want to say like who cares, but it's just like, okay, so then your optimal is between 14 and 16 sets. Great. I guess you can maybe argue for like 1% more in gains by going from 14 to 16, but To answer your question, I don't think that it's necessary. And in my experience, yeah, I think even if you keep volume constant, you're still pushing things harder. I think inevitably, if you're trying for progressive overload, maybe your form gets a little bit worse. You're trying to add that weight. That's going to lead to fatigue. And I'm definitely not saying that fatigue doesn't accumulate over a mesocycle. Certainly, if you have a deload, whatever volume you pick, assuming, I mean, it's sufficient volume to create a stimulus, you probably will get a little bit more fatigued over time. I mean, you do have people like maybe Berge and other people who say, just keep the volume low enough that you don't ever even create that fatigue, and therefore you don't need a deload at all. And I know a lot of people who get great results never doing deloads either. I mean, I think the lower your volume is, the more you can just kind of have reactive deloads instead of planning them in. But to, I guess, give a very clear answer, no, I don't think that it's required that you have this increase in stimulus. And yes, I still think that, or sorry, I don't think it's required that you have an increase in sets. And I do still think that regardless of how you're manipulating set volume, many people will still find that they become more fatigued over time and still need a deload. You can't necessarily just infinitely go on forever.
Abel, I've heard from you, I think, back when you did your volume series, that when you messed around with increasing sets from week to week, you kind of found that you could almost increase sets infinitely. It had little impact on your recovery, and you could just keep going. I would assume since then, considering some topics we've discussed previously, that you've also utilized mesocycles where you didn't change sets at all. With that being said, have you noticed any difference in your ability to progress over a period of time with each of these strategies? Have you noticed that you might need to deload a little bit sooner in one of these?
Yeah, so just first of all, I just wanted to add something to what Dave mentioned, and that's a very good point, that we get so used to being surrounded by these people in the evidence-based industry, evidence-based circles, that we assume that that's the entirety of the fitness world, and that these methods had been used by people in all walks of life for ages. But it's really not the case. Like Dave and I, for example, had a lot of discussions off air on refeeds, and refeeds, for example, are a good example of something that are getting more and more used in the evidence-based kind of sphere. But if you asked a whole bunch of bodybuilders and coaches that are not within this little niche, if you ask them about refeeds, they would be like, what? No, dieting is not eating. Refeeding is fucking eating. You don't do the two together. That's fucking dumb. Like, that would be their answer. And whether they are right or not, like, that's a separate topic. But the same thing with deloading, for example. Like, we take it for granted. Like, of course, you deload every couple of weeks. Even in the evidence-based sphere, like Dave mentioned, it's not a unanimous thing. There are people like Børge Fagerli and Menno Henselmans that are somewhat related, of course, but they don't use pre-planned deloads at all. They just do reactive deloading. So they modify kind of session RPEs and deload an exercise individually if that stagnates, or maybe a muscle group if that stagnates within one session. But they will basically do multiple year-long progressions with zero pre-planned deloading, unless there is some traveling coming up or something like that. So that's just good to keep in mind that it is something that we use in this kind of little niche circle, but it's not something that's unanimously accepted across the board. So with regards to your question about my experimentation with higher volumes and what I do these days with deloading. Well, first of all, on the deloading thing, I have done exactly what Menno and Børge did for years before. So I went, I don't know, like maybe 1,000 days, one streak, zero deloading, just hit the gym, and I was trying to progress every single time. Could I have gotten better gains if I deloaded? Maybe. I did do other things reactively to kind of manage training stress and work around things if something was hurting. But I think your kind of initial question was like, could we make longer progress with less deloading if we didn't increase sets? Like, that was sort of one thing that was implied in there. And I think anecdotally, the answer is yes. I mean, I think Many times deloading is something that is good to do as a kind of just in case type policy, because inevitably something will always come up, like little niggles, little injuries, like you overuse a certain area. So it's good to do it for that, because sometimes just working around might not be enough to really let certain connective tissue flare-ups completely calm down. So from that perspective, it can be good. And also just psychologically, I mean, people are not robots. And even I didn't have a gym now for 4 months, and it was a really depressing period. Now I've been back for slowly 2 months, and I've been pushing myself pretty hard, and I'm getting to the point where, okay, I'm not loving the gym as much anymore. Like, I could actually use some time off just to reignite that fire once again. So that can be a case for deloading. And as far as my high volume experimentation, I mean, yes, so I pushed it up to a crazy high level, and I actually just pulled up my old logs in preparation for this. And it wasn't a weekly set addition. It was just basically when I was very confident that I can tolerate this amount of volume and I'm still progressing, I just tried to push W and higher. And for most of my upper body musculature, I've gotten up to about 42 sets per week. For some muscles, I got up to as high as 49. Jeez. And to be honest, I only didn't go even higher because I don't want to do that much. Like, how long are my sessions gonna be? This is ridiculous. And actually, this is it's pretty crazy, but I've actually heard. So if you listen to my volume month series, Menno Henselmans actually mentioned that he did 70 sets per muscle group. So I didn't even do it for all muscles. He did it for his whole body, 70 sets. He said, all of my workouts were 3 hours. And, like, you have to, basically your entire workout is geared towards injury management, which is not the most fun way to train. But it can be done. And I think what that was a good case study for is that your ability to handle volume and even progress with really high volumes is not necessarily the same as making better gains with higher volumes. And I think that's one of the big kind of theoretical critiques to this set increasing kind of model, or this MEV to MRV type model, in that, there might be some people who, when they go from 10 sets to 20 sets, which is a reasonably narrow range, it's a very clear sign, like, okay, my performance is dropping up. I just cannot progress anymore. I'm clearly overreaching. And I would say those people are the lucky ones, because your body is giving you a clear signal. It's time to deload. Now, in my case, I probably have this huge kind of adaptive range where I can probably just still make very similar gains, just I get to do more work, which at certain times during the year is actually a good thing, because I would actually prefer to spend more time in the gym so that I don't have to deal with other issues in my life, which is kind of my own personal problem. But in a general sense, I'm just probably getting the same gains for just a lot more work. And so, yeah, I could tolerate almost 50 sets a week. And since then, of course, I've gotten back to maybe like 12 to 15 for most of my muscle groups. And I would say that my progress is just as good as it was then, just my joints are hurting less and my sessions are much shorter. So, yeah, I think that was a good case study for that. I don't know if you have any follow-up on that, but that's how it was.
Relating to all of these points is that I'm not sure how much work capacity matters when it comes to maximizing muscle hypertrophy. And yes, it can be so poor that you can't even complete this bare minimum amount of volume that you need to grow. But Abel, you gave a great example in your video, basically talking about CrossFit athletes and have these insane work capacities that doesn't necessarily lead to more muscle growth. And again, we can always just spend more time in the gym. We can always spend an extra 30 minutes to perform a couple of more sets, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you need that to get better, or it is a more productive style of training.
Yeah, and if I could just add real quick, Mike, I just want to say, in terms of evidence, because this is actually, I had 2 clients recently who were kind of talking to me about this and just saying, like, well, if I can do more volume, shouldn't I? Like, if I can recover from it, doesn't the evidence say? And it's like, I really think that's flawed thinking. I don't think that we have evidence that the more volume, I mean, okay, so you can look at these studies that do show that those who did more volume made greater gains. However, it's obviously we have like the standard issues with the studies, right? Were these people really training to failure? I have run a study in a lab, and you're working usually with untrained college athletes, but even trained college athletes, and not even athletes, just college students a lot of time. And most of them are not really training that hard. Even when you have somebody like there, because that's how the studies are often run. Like, okay, keep pushing, keep pushing. The average person just doesn't know how to like push that hard. So that's one point. Another one that's often brought up, which I think is legitimate, is saying that there's water retention and there's a volumizing effect to having the more volume. I know they say, oh, well, like they waited 24 hours or whatever it is, but I think there's some evidence that that swelling effect can last longer. But thirdly, is that I don't see brought up that much is it's almost like when you look at these supplement studies and it's like, okay, so this supplement increased lean body mass more than another supplement. Great. Okay. So creatine, for example, you could add, some water, but also probably like legitimate lean body mass. If that looks like, if you have like somebody who's, just increasing over the years and they're just not taking anything, if creatine has a little bit of a spike, but then it's the same, does that matter over time? Yes, they're getting a little spike, but was taking creatine for 20 years necessarily better than if you just added it after 20 years? Would it have been cumulative? We don't know. But that's one of my issues like with supplements. And with this added volume, maybe it is the case that acutely over 8 weeks of a study, the 20 set group did make more progress than the 8 set group. Does that mean that over 10 years, they're going to continue to make a greater percentage gains? Or is it just that eventually, okay, they've gotten that increased effect and then it's going to be similar over time? Now, I'm not saying that we know one way or the other, but I suspect based on the tons of anecdotal experience we see around us, that that's not the case, that they're going to make better progress over time. And there was even a study, I think Greg Nuckols and company, like they touched on that, and they said that there was basically, they either adjusted set volume based on what they were doing currently, or they just gave them like a generic high volume amount. And the one that was actually based on what they were doing, I believe, was better than the other one, where basically for some people that high volume, it might be way more than what they were doing. It might be less than what they were doing. Obviously, you want to look at your individual results and how you've been experiencing results and adjust. So I'm not trying to say volume adjustments don't matter at all, but to just say for everybody, higher volume is better and doing as much as you can possibly recover from is going to lead to better results. I just don't think there's sufficient evidence to suggest that at this point.
Yeah, no, I think that was some much needed context related to the papers you were talking about. There's one by, the lead author was Scarpelli, and I think that was, they took the individual's baseline volume and increased it by 20% from there, or they just increased it to the standardized high set volume. And there was also a paper by Aube, A-U-B-E, where they considered the individual's baseline volume, and then they put them into 3 groups, either increasing volume from there or decreasing. So it is really nice to see these results taking that into consideration, what the subject's baseline volume was. And based on the context you provided, Dave, I think this comes to a really important point, and that is that we ultimately need a way to track our progress. And even if progressing from MEV to MRV was proven to be 0.5% more effective, which we don't really know, the more variables you are changing, the less we can be sure about the sufficiency of our current training program. Abel, you mentioned in your video that basically tracking your gym performance is kind of the best practical proxy to ensure that we're growing muscle. And if you're increasing set volume and changing these other variables, assessing our performance becomes more cloudy. And then in that case, to truly, if we can't accurately assess our training performance, then that means that we should be assessing literal muscle growth to determine if our program is working. And we can't practically do that. And even a DEXA has been shown to have, 2 to 3% error, and there's multiple variables that need to be considered. So for those reasons, I think that people could potentially be shooting themselves in the foot a bit more by, always trying to manipulate their set volume from week to week, changing this, that, and the other variable. What do you guys think about that? Abel, your thoughts?
Yeah, that's basically exactly what I think is all else being equal, the less variables you manipulate, I think the better it's going to be. So, and I think that's especially the case for more novice and early intermediate type lifters, because for them, it is completely reasonable to expect week to week progress, basically. Now, for someone who has a lot of training experience, that's not really realistic at a certain point. So I'm not going to add 2.5 kilos to the bar week to week, except maybe on leg presses or hip thrusts, or on some movements, you can extend that a little bit longer. So maybe at a certain point, you're looking at maybe, every 4 weeks, you're going to be able to lift 2.5 kilos more. So from that standpoint, this set progression and RIR changing, reps in reserve changing, maybe that's more appropriate for me at this point than it would have been 5 years ago for someone like me. And, Mike and these guys at RP are not the first people to use some model like this. I mean, I think Eric Helms commonly likes to use a rep undulation pattern, like every 4 weeks. So maybe you start out with a weight that you can do 3 sets of 8, then you go 3 sets of 6, 3 sets of 4, and then you deload back to 3 sets of 8. I mean, in a way, you're doing kind of something similar because you're changing some variables and you're looking for that progress every 4th week. Menno, for example, he likes to introduce multiple rep ranges for people. So you might do this kind of DUP undulation in rep targets. I am not entirely sure, actually, if those things are actually doing anything or they are just serving the purpose of distracting you until you're waiting that progress out. So it might actually be the case that you could just keep going back to the gym and do the exact same thing and just wait until you progress. But there might be the case that maybe there's some muscle-specific muscle growth with those different rep ranges or something like that. So I'm not opposed to those ideas. So I think for advanced lifters, something like what Mike is using can be appropriate. And I think, the only reason why it was worth addressing his method specifically is because out of all these guys, I think he is the only one who has a very specific theoretical model based on which the practical approach is based off of. So, but I don't know if I answered the question.
Dave, anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I hope it doesn't come across as like, all right, this is like the anti-Mike Israetel podcast or anything like that. Like,
that's the title for this one, actually.
I mean, not only do I like Mike on a personal level, but just I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with what he's doing. I just think that it's interesting. I remember seeing somebody made an argument against like a certain religion, and they were saying that basically, like, if all of our knowledge was wiped out suddenly, and then humans had to like re-evolve and all these things, like we would come up with physics again. We would come up with like biology, like these things would be reemerged, calculus, etc. But this religion wouldn't be. It would just be lost to history. And when I look at like training variables and ideas, there are certain things that if all of our knowledge on this was wiped, we would come back to the idea that, oh, look, lifting weights makes us grow. And, oh, as we get stronger, we tend to get bigger. I don't think, hey, if we start at a low volume and increase to a higher volume and then we reset and we do that again, like, I just don't think that idea is going to stand the test of time long term. I think certainly, as Abel said, Mike's not the first one to come up with manipulating volume. And I don't think manipulating volume is wrong. Like, I want to be clear. I know I said that before, but I don't think manipulating volume is at all a bad idea, especially for strength phases. Anytime I've had like a specialization of a lift, trying to get strong as possible, I increase net volume and I increase frequency. But in terms of how are we trying to gain as much muscle as possible, I just don't see people talking about MEV to MRV in 50 years, for example.
Yeah. This might come across as the anti-MEV to MRV podcast, but again, I've had Mike on. He's absolutely fantastic. But at the end of the day, I think we're all really interested in this theory of optimal, this unicorn of optimal, and just how do we get there. So when there is a training system that has become so popular and is more or less proposed as this could be theoretically optimal, it's worth discussing it. It's worth critiquing it in the pursuit of getting closer to the truth of what could be the best training system to maximize muscle hypertrophy.
Yeah.
Abel, anything to add before we transition topics here to the other end of the volume spectrum?
Yeah, okay. I'll just quickly add something just on this is not the anti-MRV podcast or whatever. The only thing that made me, I guess, that prompted me to address something specific to Mike Israetel in a video is that, Mike being Mike, that's part of his charm. That's part of why he's so popular. But when he goes on another podcast and discusses this, he's very good with analogies. He is wickedly powerful verbally. So he can give a really good interview. And I think he gets so lost in the art of communicating his best message that maybe unintentionally, I think he can present the other side of all of this in an unfair lighting. So I think if you tune into some of Mike's work, it can come across as in, okay, this method that he's preaching, this is just like understanding how muscle hypertrophy works. Like, why wouldn't anybody do it this way? And then these guys that are just biasing things towards load progression and are just looking to increase the load on the bar, these guys just don't understand hypertrophy training. They think that strength and size is the same. Like, why are you trying to get strong as fuck? Like, you're trying to build muscle. Don't you get it? And then, of course, this is very clearly reflected in some of his following, which I'm not judging Mike based on that, because I'm sure he wishes that this wasn't the case and his messages were better understood. But if you read some of the comments under my video, it's very clear to see that basically when the general understanding is, okay, yeah, sure, you guys can do your load progression and keep a more sustainable volume, and that's all good, but Mike is trying to get optimal hypertrophy, and that is what you guys don't get. So yeah, you're trying to make your sustainable gains, but if you want to get as jacked as possible, well, of course you have to increase sets week to week. So in a way, I didn't even address it to Mike. I was addressing it to the people that are tuning into Mike's message and are not really getting the thing out of it that I think they should be getting out of it. So just some minor clarification there.
Great. No, I think that's super important to consider and some much needed points. Kind of shifting this spotlight over to Dave. Dave, you recently had a 3-part series with Dr. Scott Stevenson talking about many training related concepts. And ultimately, it kind of sounded like you came to the conclusion that you're going to be running DC training. Have you gotten the opportunity to start that yet? And have you run this in the past?
So I've been very familiar with DC training for years. I mean, Dante, as I've said, was probably one of my early, he definitely influenced me probably from the time of high school, like his principles at least, but I never really went into DC training, in part because there's so much emphasis on it being an advanced training routine and not to do it until you've really put your gains in and everything. And I just felt, because especially since I didn't have like a great response to training, I felt like, well, I wasn't there yet. I hadn't really like earned the right to do it, which I actually do think it could be fine for intermediate lifters. But at the time, that's why I delayed it. And then I was going to do it. And then Scott came out with Fortitude Training. So then I had done that instead. So I am excited to do it. I was actually going to start yesterday, but as we were talking off air, yesterday was the end of my diet. And after horrible sleep the last week and about 16 out of 20 days were at 1,000 calories. I just did not want to go into, I think I woke up at 3 a.m., lied in bed until 5 a.m. to like officially weigh in and take my pictures. I was like, this is just not going to lead to a good workout. So I just did kind of like a pump workout yesterday. So today will actually be my first day doing DC training. And it's an interesting method. I mean, I don't know if you want, I can kind of describe it, but basically it's a very low volume, high intensity, moderately high frequency routine that is pushing to failure with rest pause training and then doing these like intense stretches afterwards.
So I'm kind of curious, considering you're a man of experimentation and you'll give everything a go, is this simply something that you want to trial, or on the surface, do you think this training style more so aligns with your psychology and it is something you actually prefer, kind of leaving your soul on the gym floor after each session?
Yeah, I mean, there is definitely an excitement to try it. Scott, I've had a lot of talks with Scott, on air, but also off air, and we've talked about my psychology quite a bit. Not surprisingly, we've talked about me being kind of pessimistic, and as far as like my genetics and my results and everything like that. I like to think I'm a realist, but I'm sure every pessimist does, and so I would say with that excitement, I it's like a tempered excitement where I'm not doing this because I think, wow, like, we're really going to see some massive changes. Again, power of belief is a real thing, and placebo effect is great, but I'm not thinking that there's going to be like, you're not going to see my physique and think, oh wow, like this is a big change. But I actually do find this kind of training fun. I do want to be able to say that I've done it. It's one of the few things that I haven't really given a full shot to. And it's funny because like really I've done all of the principles individually. I've done rest pause training. I've done the extreme stretches since high school. I've done extreme stretches. I'm not even that big of a fan of them, but I will do the routine as laid out. But it just to do it comprehensively, and it definitely does go with my psychology of pushing myself. That's actually one of the issues that I have with, and this is something I'd like to talk to Mike about. I just had Eric Helms on recently. That's not published yet, but we just didn't have enough time to get to this question. But one of the issues I have with the whole leaving reps in the tank is I find it very hard psychologically, even though I know objectively that it's not going to change anything. Let's say you're dieting and you did whatever, 225 for 10, and that was one RIR, and you're like, okay, cool, like that's where I want to be. But you're dieting, so maybe you lose a little muscle. So next week you get to 9 for like 225 for 9, and you realize that if you go to 10, it's going to be a 0 RIR. Do you stick with the fact that, hey, I'm trying to stay to 1 RIR training, or do you say, well, fuck that, I need to hit 10 again, and so now your training's even harder? Because you could make the logical argument that, well, hey, you should still stop at 9 because going back to the, was it that you actually gained muscle, or what we were talking about before, like, is it chicken or egg kind of thing? You could make the argument that no, like if you can only do 9 now, that means you've already lost the muscle. It doesn't make sense to then push yourself even harder and then be more fatigued for the next workout. But mentally, I have a very hard time accepting that, or even when bulking, to not progress. Hey, I think Abel, you might have even mentioned this on your talk. I mean, certainly people have talked about it where I could progress, but it was just harder than last week. 225 for 10 had 1 rep in the tank. If I do 11, I progressed, but really it was just harder. You might not have actually gained anything. So it almost kind of takes that whole questioning out of it, of either way, I am pushing myself to failure. And I'm glad you kind of pointed out, like, is it my psychology? Because I'm not saying that I think that leads to better results. I just like to do that. And I like to know I went all out. I don't have to question, well, this one was 2 RIR, that one was 3 RIR. And that's purely a psychological thing. So as much as I might not be in favor of some of these methods that we talked about, I do want to be clear that it's not because I think this is a superior method for results. My just psychology is I really do like to push myself hard in the gym and know that I gave it my all.
Excellent. When it comes to this topic of DC training, as you mentioned, Dave, it's typically portrayed as this advanced training concept. And when we consider the principles of the system in relation to the advanced lifter, it more or less suggests that advanced lifters need more time to recover from their training. And this is perhaps in contrast to what many in the evidence-based community would think, and it's that as you become advanced, you become more resistant to growth. You need to generate a greater stimulus, and that's going to require the performance of more hard sets. This is something I've been thinking a lot about recently, and I feel like my position is sliding towards, as you become more advanced, you probably need less volume. And maybe there are a couple of reasons for this. I think one is that as an advanced athlete, your strength is reaching its absolute limits due to being able to lift higher absolute loads. You're probably going to be able to create greater disruption per training session. Another reason is that as you become more advanced, you should probably be getting better at taking sets to true failure. And then in addition to that, you should also be able to do a better job of maintaining form and the mind-muscle connection as you get to failure. At this point in my training career, I feel like I'm really able to maximize the stimulus from each set I perform. Back in my day, coming up in the ranks, following the IFBB Pro workouts, I would do those 20-set leg workouts. I don't think I would be able to do that nowadays. These days with my leg training sessions, I might have 4 sets for quads and 4 sets for hamstrings, and I don't think I can do any more. And I think perhaps a reason for that is when in my initial stages in my career, when I was performing all of these sets, sure, I was going to failure, but due to my inexperience, I think that, perhaps those last 4 or 5 reps were getting sloppy. It was taking tension away from the muscle I was working. Whereas now, when those sets get hard, I can really manage all of these factors and stay in the set, keep tension where it needs to be, and not let form go awry and get to failure, if that makes sense. With all those points to consider, Abel, what are your thoughts on the progression of volume throughout the lifting career? Do you think advanced athletes on the average probably need a little bit less than they were doing, a little bit more, or it probably just stays the same for the most part?
So I think that's a very interesting question, and I'm not 100% sure. If I'm looking at just what I tend to see, then what I see is it tends to kind of peak out in their late intermediate, kind of in that zone where they're going from intermediate to advanced. It tends to reach a point that is slightly higher than what they needed when they were just an intermediate. And then it tends to stay the same. And then over time, it depends a little bit on which direction the person leans. So is it the more kind of Scott Stevenson-esque, try to get the most amount of stimulus out of one single set, or maybe let's not push quite as close to failure and do a little bit more to stay a bit more conservative. So depending on that, it might stay the same or might go down a little bit. And actually, it's just one thing that I forgot to mention during some of the earlier points when Dave mentioned that your training doesn't necessarily become hard over time. I mean, Dave was killing himself even as a 15-year-old in the gym. Obviously, one component of that is, to some extent, from a systematic fatigue perspective, it does become harder over time, because even though it's an 8 RM when you were 15 years old and not as strong, and it's still an 8 RM when you're 30 and you're much stronger, the lows that you're handling are still kind of crushing you, right? Like, it's still much different when you have 200 kilos on your back weighing down on you, even though from your local musculature, it's the same effort that they need to produce. So because of that, I think it's not uncommon to see people's volumes going down at the very highly advanced stages. And then I think it really just comes down to the kind of the direction that someone wants to take with their training. So I think if you ask an Eric Helms, he would probably tell you that he had to increase his volume for a lot of things to keep making progress. So, but maybe he could have decreased it if he took the more kind of Scott Stevenson-like approach. And I think he just found that not pushing quite as close to failure and just sneaking in a bit more volume was more effective for him. So I think it kind of can go either way. And just one thing on that note is, if anybody is skeptical about any of this, I think your podcast with Steve Hole and AJ Morris is a very valuable listen from that perspective. I mean, if anybody, Steve should be the poster boy of, the more volume you do, the better, and MEV, MRV. And the things that he said in there are very much along the lines of everything that we are talking about here. Like, he is not at all dogmatic about increasing his volumes over a mesocycle and trying to reach some arbitrary point. Like, he very much talked about this point of getting more out from less over time. So I think that's a very, very real phenomenon with advanced lifters.
Yeah, I think in reference to that podcast and some common ground we touched on, it is more or less that these concepts of effort and volume really do counterbalance one another. Whereas Steve, considering the MEV to MRV approach, he's starting out with uh, a lower RPE in these initial weeks so he can, and he increases volume over time. And if you are keeping the RPE moderate or a little bit lower on average on sets, I think you're just going to need to perform more volume to see the same results. And if you are taking sets to those breaking points, performing Widowmakers, you're just not going to be able to do as many sets, and you'll probably see the same results. This actually led me to post something on Instagram probably a month ago now, where I kind of was just getting at pick the training style that suits your psychology, because to me the research kind of points that you can either leave your soul on the gym floor each session and perform a low amount of volume, or you can keep a couple reps in the tank on most sets, but you're just going to need to perform more volume if you want to get to ultimately the same point at the end of the day. Dave, kind of your thoughts on that relationship. And then, even though I know you're not expecting to blow up with your experimentation with DC, do you think that a little more rest, perhaps taking sets to failure, could be beneficial for the advanced lifter?
Yeah, this is a great question, Mike, and I think probably the topic I'm most looking forward to touching on, because I think a lot of the stuff that we've talked about so far has been touched on, I don't want to call it the Mike Israetel method, but like that method versus, more traditional methods. But this whole concept of, do we actually maybe need less volume over time, I think is really interesting. So to briefly touch on the last point you made about the psychology, I do think that's important, because I saw a summary, I think it was a Mass article, and they were saying how, there's not a ton of evidence for failure training, and therefore, like, why would you do it? Because, like, why would you want to make your sessions so much harder? And I think it does come down to psychology, because maybe this is just after so many years and reading so much stuff on it. But one, I do believe, and even somebody like Brad Schoenfeld, who's obviously like super into the research, has said that he believes there is something to be said for failure training. So even somebody who's doing the research showing that it's not beneficial still believes that it's beneficial. But there's something to be said for, for me, I'd like to push myself, but it is interesting once you start to think about the idea that, that whole chicken versus the egg thing, and, what causes stimulus, because what it actually makes you realize, it's almost like, when they look at these studies on hormones, and they'll find that, even if, I think James Krieger just put out something on like testosterone and does it help? And a lot of the conclusion there is, certainly it's a factor, but it's less of a factor in strength. And I think we see that a lot of times. And that they did have examples in the studies where it affected strength quite a bit. But on average, with strength being a largely skill component, there are people who could have poor hormone levels, but incredible strength. And it's almost like this realization, like, crap, like as you get older, even if you can maintain your strength, like you probably are going to lose size. And when it, to some degree, and when it comes to training, it's like, oh, it's this weird feeling that even if I keep pushing myself to get that rep, that might not prevent the loss in size. And just like at the end of the day, it's not just about the training you're doing. Like there are other factors that affect size regardless of how much you're pushing yourself. But that being said, I still like to, push to failure a lot of the time. So in terms of this relationship, I'm sure 99% of people listening to this don't recall, but there was like back when I was getting into this, there were like a lot of ebooks out and everything. That was like kind of the popular thing. And there was this guy called Pete Sisko, and he came out, his method was like static contraction training or whatever. And so this book was, this ebook was put out, and everybody had their way of like the most muscle in 30 days. The only person left from that whole group is Tom Venuto. If you guys know him, he's the only one I still see in this space, but everybody else I haven't heard of in forever. And this guy, Pete Sisko, was talking about, he would literally just go and like do like a leg press and just do like a really intense isometric hold for like 30 seconds. And like, that would be the training. And he would talk about how his most advanced people would only train once every 2 weeks. And it was like, obviously ridiculous, right? But he was kind of talking about that principle. And then people mentioned Mike Mentzer was kind of like that, where he had good principles, but towards the end, he got kind of crazy with it. He was doing absurd beyond failure training, like, again, like once every 2 weeks or something. And to that extreme, I do think it gets a little silly. However, most people would recognize, as Abel pointed out, that a squat to failure, when you're able to do 400 pounds for reps is just inherently different than when you could do 135 for reps. It's just going to be different on your body. And we have so much talk as far as it's got to get harder over time. You got to do more volume, all these things. But the reality is, for a lot of people, they do find that they can't handle as much. And it's not just an age thing. I mean, it's just that you've gotten so much stronger. Maybe your mind-muscle connection is better, but it becomes actually harder. And that's kind of going back to the start of this podcast, why I say I don't think it necessarily needs to be hard in terms of how hard you're pushing. Some people do less. And, we've used Jeff Elbers as kind of the low volume guy, where he did try higher volumes. He listened to the rest of the team and they said, hey, you could probably grow more. He tried it and he's like, this is not working as well. And he went back to 3 workouts a week with pretty low volume. So I do think,
and he's still progressing
30 years later. But yeah, I don't think that if you just look at like real world examples, there are that many people doing way more volume now that they're advanced. And it sounds like you kind of made the conclusion, Mike, that you might need less. And I think, I certainly don't think that's wrong. I don't know if the average person is going to find that they can do like way less, certainly to maintain, but even to progress. I mean, I think there's a lot more to it than just the total volume you're doing. And I think that's a really good point that you might actually, I don't think I would put it out there as a general principle that you're going to need less volume, but I think you will need to focus on recovery more. And that for a lot of people might mean less frequency or less volume.
Excellent point. And I do think it's really fascinating, as you brought up, when you talked with Brad thinks the jury's still out when it comes to failure training for the advanced athlete. And it might be, and he thinks it might be essential for that population. And perhaps that is because, he's so involved in the research that he understands the limitations of the subjects that are utilized in these training studies. And we can only make so much of those results, which is why I think the anecdotes of people like Dante are so important, because he's been working for a long time with the best of the best, the most muscular individuals, and he's found these trends. And again, it's not a controlled trial, but it's not worth completely discrediting this information. It's something to consider. And yes, maybe, and I'm leaning towards the position that advanced athletes might need to lower their volume a little bit, or as you said, prioritize recovery, which I think is an excellent way to put it. But you probably even need to lower your volume a little bit more if you do agree that advanced lifters should train to failure for the most part, if in your intermediate stages you weren't really training to failure. And a really fascinating topic that you touched on with Scott in your podcast was this concept of the effective reps model evolving over the training career. And basically, Scott theorized that it could be the case that for an advanced lifter to achieve any effective reps within a set, they need to take it to failure just to get one effective rep from that set. Based on your conversation with him, maybe some stuff you discussed after, and I'm sure you've been thinking about this concept as well, what are your thoughts? Do you think this could be plausible? Do you think it's probably not the case based on what you've seen in the literature?
Yeah, just to real briefly touch on Dante again, if you actually look at his, so the split I'm going to be doing is his traditional 2-way split. So it's ABA, and then the next week is BAB. That's actually his, it's not a beginner split, obviously, but that's the kind of intro one. After that, he switches to a 3-way split, which is more or less a push-pull legs split. And so in that case, obviously your frequency is going down. And then his most advanced split, that again, at that point, when somebody's that advanced, he's kind of working with them more individually and will kind of customize it. But that actually becomes a body part split. And so the volume per week is similar, but his argument is these guys who are this advanced and pushing this much weight can't recover and then do it 3 days later. But if you look at the volume, just so real quick, it might be, so in the start workout, it's an A workout would be 1 set of chest, 1 set of shoulders, 1 set of triceps, back thickness, back width, right? And when I say 1 set, I mean 1 rest pause set. So it's kind of 3 sets. And then you'll do it again 4 days later. With the advanced split, it might be chest, 3 exercises, rest paused. back, 3 exercises, rest pause, whatever. And what you'll notice then is that per session volume, per muscle group is higher, but the frequency is then once a week, which would lend to the argument of maybe at an advanced level, you almost need more of a stimulus in that workout, but then you've now crushed it in that workout and you need longer to recover. Now, we have plenty of evidence against that. If you look at, I remember Lane Norton back in the day saying, everybody says, oh, there's no way I could train legs again by doing it. Like, I just kill my legs. I have to wait a whole week. And his argument was, well, yeah, because you're doing 20 sets. Cut that into twice a week and you'll notice improvements. And he did that and he noticed improvements. So we have both anecdotal evidence and scientific evidence to suggest that the higher frequencies with maybe less volume per session is beneficial. I'm just laying it out there that a lot of these pro bodybuilders, the reason that they do these body part splits, why they are forever popular despite what the evidence suggests, is because a lot of them do feel like they need to get that session volume in to create a stimulus and then recover. And I don't want to put it out there that that's my belief or that we don't have evidence against that, because we actually do have evidence, significant evidence against that. But again, as you said, I hate to dismiss so much anecdote there. And then, sorry, remind me what the specific question you laid out there was for me.
The effective reps model.
Effective reps, okay.
Evolving, yes.
Thanks. So I think, literally, I think Stronger by Science just put out an article of like, there's insufficient evidence for effective reps, which I haven't read the article yet.
It's a bit more nuanced than just the last 5, like the list just goes on.
Right, which I'm sure is true. I haven't even read the article. I will get to it at some point. I don't know if I believe in that model per se. I think certainly it would be very hard to convince me that you're going to be able to get to an advanced level if you're just always doing like 3 or 4 RAR. I don't see that happening. But we do have very impressive individuals who very rarely train to failure. Like top level powerlifters who, again, they're not bodybuilders, but they often have a ton of muscle and they're really not pushing to failure. So I mean, all the time or even that frequently. So I kind of like the idea. And again, going to my psychology, I'm like, yeah, you really got to have that intensity. But I would probably, I still like to be evidence-based, and I would have a hard time hanging my hat on the idea that you need to push to failure to get optimal growth all the time, or that it's only that last rep that's doing anything. I don't think there's sufficient evidence beyond just kind of like the bro idea of it.
Abel, where does your hypothesis lie on advanced lifters potentially needing to train to failure?
Yeah, it's so I was smiling a lot throughout the whole time because just a whole bunch of troll comments that came to mind that I could have made, but I will stay serious. So I think it would be incredibly just intellectually lazy to just say, oh, all these studies were made on untrained subjects, so I don't give a shit what this meta-analysis says or whatever. So that I won't go there, obviously. But, I think there is a reason to be skeptical about the lack of failure training from studies, because however well they are controlling failure in some of these studies, I'm sure in some of these studies it's just complete bullshit. Like they're actually just wussing out because they are not supervised well enough. So I'm sure that happens, but I'm also sure that in some it is pretty legit, close to failure training at least. But we can be at least confident that failure training is not the same as a Jordan Peters or a Scott Stevenson pushing to failure. So that is one thing. And also a whole bunch of other limitations, for example, short rest periods that most of the time they are using in these studies. So just a lot of things that confound the lack of benefits from failure training, but also, for example, the super high volumes. So, but I don't want to go back there again. But we have to take some of that with a grain of salt. And I also haven't dug through all the individual studies in that not meta-analysis, but sort of informal meta-analysis that Greg Knuckles put out on the effective reps model. But again, it's one of those where if you look at some of the citations there, and it almost seems like it's not only that training to failure is not beneficial, but even training somewhat close to failure is not any more beneficial. It seems like that from that breakdown. Now, I listened to a podcast with Greg Nuckols on Jacob Skeppis's podcast, and he cited some of these studies there. And he described like, okay, so if you look at this study, for example, one group did 50 ineffective reps approximately in this session. The other did approximately 0. So basically, they were not anywhere close to failure. And there was no statistically significant differences in muscle growth by the end of it. So if you look at that breakdown, it seems like, man, you can just stop every set when it just slightly starts becoming remotely challenging, and you're going to get just as good of a result. Now, at the end of that podcast, Greg made the conclusion and said, so basically, I think some people are actually better off training pretty close to failure. Some people will be better off leaving 1 or 2 reps in the tank. I don't think anyone will be best off leaving like 4 or 5 reps in the tank. So even for him, he wrote the meta. Even his conclusion is that probably you should train pretty close to failure. So sometimes you do see these things in studies where that thing again, where you're not smart enough to explain why it's wrong, but you know it's wrong. And anecdotally, yes, we do see some people training to failure. We see some people training a bit further away from failure, but we don't see anybody just completely not even approaching that point. But if you look at the evidence, that could actually be a perfectly legitimate way to train. So yeah, I'm not sure. As far as training to actual failure, I think you can set your training up in a way where that's at the very least not going to be any worse than not training to failure. I'm not convinced that there is an actual benefit to it, but honestly, I could be convinced of that. I'm not super intent on that idea.
Excellent. Dave, anything to add here?
No, I think those are great points. I mean, it's pretty rare. I would agree that anybody is saying, yeah, you can just train for RIR all the time and you'll make good progress. Yeah, once you start getting between like 0 RIR and beyond failure and like 1 RIR, I don't know if there's a huge difference. I think when they look at like even mechanistically, it seems like all the fibers are engaged at that point as much as they seem like they can be. Again, I think that psychology in me wants to believe that there is something to it. And certainly, I mean, there's no shortage of very intelligent professional bodybuilders like Scott Stevenson and even like John Meadows and stuff like that, who will talk about that they really, truly believe that when they push that hard, they see differences. Now, again, how much is pharmacology involved there? It's really hard to know. But I wouldn't be surprised if there was a study that eventually showed, wow, like those people who really trained to failure had better results. But obviously, like we're not going to see that because we're saying right here that we're talking about it having a benefit for advanced lifters. And not only are advanced lifters very rarely part of any studies, but the difference in their progress would be almost immeasurable. I mean, how much, if you gained a pound versus 1.1 pounds, that year, I just don't think we're going to be able to measure that. So does it make a difference? I really could see it making a difference at that advanced stage. But I'd be surprised if we ever have any evidence for it. And I'm not remotely surprised that when we look at beginner to intermediate lifters, we don't see too much of a difference.
Abel, any additional thoughts there?
Yeah, just one thing that I wanted to mention previously is, which might be not the best thing to kind of finish on here because it would have been better earlier on. But when Dave mentioned that, earlier. Yeah. Can you edit it in a bit earlier so it's not stupid? So when Dave mentioned that a lot of these pro bodybuilders are training with more volume in one session and their frequency is lower, I think there is definitely a possibility that for them, with really big and strong people, that's the best way to stimulate more growth, because you really have to, this is going to be a Mike Israelian phrase, to really fuck shit up to move the needle. So that is a possibility. Another possibility is that it's just the same, like equally beneficial. And if you look at the frequency research, that's kind of where things are pointing at now, is that this whole muscle protein synthesis stuff, it's not like you have to stimulate it all the time to keep growing as an advanced lifter, because you can do more volume in one session, or you can do less volume in more sessions, and it basically comes out at the same place. But there's also that hardcore kind of bodybuilding mindset, which is, I think, especially with these guys, that, you know, pharmacology and everything aside, I mean, they are crazy motivated individuals usually. And I think they just need to feel like they are working very, very hard. I mean, my leg workouts, I do like 3 sets, sometimes even 2 sets for my quads in one session. And I think my quads are growing well. But if I really loved training legs, then it would be like, man, like this is a joke, and my workout didn't even start yet. So, and I think that's the same reason why a lot of these guys are, you know, always only eating rice and white fish and things like that, even in the off season when they need to eat like 5,000-6,000 calories, because they always need to feel like they're working hard at something. Like, it's not good if eating is fun. It has to suck. I have to feel sick while I'm eating. So I think it might be some of that. So it's a little bit hard to tell. And I just had a brief question to Dave, just because you're more familiar with Dante and also Fortitude training and stuff. When these guys are talking about training to failure, is that like you're actually failing the rep? For example, on a chest press, you're like dropping the load in midst the set, or you're just stopping at a 0 RIR?
Yeah. So in Fortitude training, he breaks it up into 3 different days. The Fortitude training gets a little complicated because there's pump days, load days, and then muscle round days. So on load days, that's like the heavy day. That is, you're completing the rep with good form. You shouldn't be actually like failing. Pump days could be like anything, all up, like all out, drop sets, all that craziness. And then MR days, it's basically like a cluster set, and you're only supposed to be hitting one true failure point. But again, you're still, I've seen him do both, where you're completing the rep or you're not. Dante's method, I think, is a little more straightforward. So that one, you are going in all 3 of the rest pauses, you're going to all out, but you are supposed to complete the rep. And then at the end, you can do like a static hold. So you could argue that that's then like beyond failure. So like you finish your last rep, you got it, but now you're coming down and you're just like literally just holding until you can't anymore. And then you're doing that extreme stretch afterwards. So I would call it beyond failure, but I also don't think a lot of these guys like take that much of a distinction between they just barely eked out the last rep and they tried again and then they failed. Because I mean, obviously there's a difference. Like a lot of, I mean, obviously you guys know this, like you might go down and you just realize pretty quickly, oh, I don't have this. And then you just stop. Yeah. Like, you know, there's a difference between just stopping and saying, I'm going to try for 10 seconds and then fail. Like, you know, I don't think it's this huge issue if you go down and you just, okay, I don't have it. You know, I don't see it as like a hugely different result there.
Yeah, that's very true. No, it's just good to distinguish because people are just it's kind of like life sentence in prison. Like, okay, what do we mean 20 years or do we mean life sentence?
Right.
It's kind of the same thing with failure. It's the same thing with failure training. Like people just define it differently. So 0 RIR and maybe like giving a slight go and okay, I won't have this. That's very different than doing that 10-second try, because that I could see that as being disproportionately more fatiguing. So.
Yeah. Yep.
And then that just opens up a whole can of worms with the issues in research papers not using a consistent term for failure. And, you know, we ended at volitional fatigue, or we made sure to end the set when the subject literally couldn't perform another rep. And then that just confounds
failure and just all
everything
that,
even more.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
But before we go down that rabbit hole, you guys have been extremely generous with your time. I think we covered so many fantastic points in this podcast. I really enjoyed the conversation. It was filled with nuance, diving into those, 1% differences that may or may not result in 0.1 millimeters on your biceps. But hey,
right.
That's why we're here. That's what we love to talk about. I will, if you guys are interested in supporting and contacting Abel and Dave, their information will be in the show notes. Each of them have a brilliant podcast. that if you enjoy this one and you don't listen to theirs, I'm not sure what you're doing. But check out the show notes for more information on these guys. That does it for another episode of the Muscle Memoirs Podcast. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thanks, man.